What if I told you that the exhaustion you feel is not a sign that something is wrong with you, but rather a message from the deepest part of yourself, a voice that has been trying to speak to you for longer than you might realize? There are moments in life when the weight of simply existing becomes almost unbearable, when getting out of bed feels like lifting a mountain, when the routines that once seemed manageable now drain every ounce of energy from your body and spirit. You might look around and see others moving through their days with apparent ease, smiling at the right moments, saying the right things, and you wonder what is broken inside you that makes everything feel so heavy. But what if nothing is broken? What if this exhaustion, this bone-deep weariness, is actually your inner truth trying to break through the surface of a life that has become misaligned with who you really are? Carl Jung spoke often about the persona, that mask we wear to meet the expectations of the world around us. It is not entirely false, this mask. It contains parts of us, aspects we have learned to emphasize because they help us navigate social spaces, professional environments, family dynamics. But the persona is not the whole self. It is a compromise, a negotiation between the inner world and the outer demands. And for some people, for those who live primarily in the depths of their own consciousness, maintaining this persona requires an extraordinary expenditure of energy. Every interaction that demands you be someone slightly other than you are, every conversation that schemes the surface when you long for substance, every smile that does not quite reach the truth of what you feel inside, all of these moments accumulate. They build up like sediment in a river, slowly clogging the flow of your authentic life force. You might have noticed this exhaustion creeping in gradually, or perhaps it arrived suddenly, like a wall you walked into without warning. One day you were managing, functioning, keeping all the pieces in motion, and the next day you could barely find a reason to continue. The tasks that once seemed important now feel hollow. The relationships that once brought comfort now feel like performances you no longer have the strength to give. You sit in meetings or gatherings and feel as though you are watching yourself from a distance, a strange observer of your own life, disconnected from the words coming out of your mouth. This disconnection is not madness. It is not depression in the clinical sense, though it may wear that face. It is often something deeper, something that medication alone cannot touch, because it is not a malfunction of the brain, but a rebellion of the soul. The soul, if we can use that word without it carrying too much religious weight, is the part of you that knows what is true for you. It is not loud. It does not argue. It simply withdraws its energy when you move too far from your own center. Jung called this process of moving toward your true self individuation, and he understood it not as a destination you arrive at, but as a lifelong journey of becoming more fully who you actually are, beneath all the layers of conditioning, expectation, and adaptation. Individuation requires that you listen to the parts of yourself that do not fit easily into the world's categories. It asks that you honor the complexity of your inner life, even when that complexity makes others uncomfortable. And it demands, sometimes ruthlessly, that you stop living in ways that betray your deepest nature. This is where exhaustion becomes a teacher. When you are too tired to maintain the act, when you no longer have the energy to be who everyone expects you to be, something essential is revealed. You begin to see how much of your life has been constructed around external validation, around the need to be acceptable, to be understood in conventional terms, to fit into a story that was never really yours. The exhaustion strips away your ability to perform, and in that stripping away, you are left with something raw and true. It is uncomfortable. It can feel like failure. You might look at your life and see all the ways you're not measuring up, all the places where you have withdrawn, all the relationships that have faded because you no longer have the energy to pretend. But underneath that sense of failure is something else, something quieter and more honest. There are people who live primarily in their inner world, who think deeply about everything, who cannot help but question and reflect and turn experiences over in their minds long after others have moved on. For these people, the outer world often feels like a foreign country where everyone speaks a language they only partially understand. They learn the phrases, they mimic the gestures, but something always feels slightly off, slightly translated. Jung called these individuals introverts, though that word has been diluted and misunderstood in popular culture. Introversion, in the Jungian sense, is not about being shy or antisocial. It is about where your psychic energy naturally flows. For the introvert, energy moves inward, toward reflection, toward the inner images and ideas and feelings that populate the interior landscape. The outer world, with all its noise and demand, is draining not because it is bad, but because it requires a constant outward flow of energy that does not naturally replenish itself through external engagement. If you are someone whose energy moves this way, you have likely spent much of your life trying to adapt to a world that values the opposite. Extroversion is the default setting of most social structures. Workplaces reward those who speak up quickly, who network effortlessly, who seem energized by constant interaction. Social life is organized around gatherings, events, activities that require sustained outward engagement. Even friendships are often measured by frequency of contact, by visibility, by the ability to show up consistently in ways that require you to be on, to be present in a particular extroverted mode. And if you are not naturally wired this way, if you need long stretches of solitude to process your experiences, if you find small talk exhausting and crave conversations that go beneath the surface, you are constantly swimming against the current. You can do it. Many people do it for years, even decades. But it costs something. It costs energy, authenticity, and eventually, it costs your sense of connection to your own life. The exhaustion you feel may be your inner self saying no. Not in anger, not in rebellion, but in a quiet, firm insistence that something must change. You cannot keep living at this pace. You cannot keep giving energy to things that do not feed you. You cannot keep pretending that the life you have built is the life you actually want. This realization is terrifying because it often comes without a clear alternative. You do not necessarily know what the right life looks like. You just know that this one, the one you're living right now, is slowly draining the life out of you. And so you are left in a strange in-between space, too exhausted to continue as you have been, but not yet clear about what comes next. Jung understood this in-between space as essential to the process of transformation. He spoke of it as a kind of death and rebirth, not literal but psychological. The old self, the one constructed around external expectations and adaptive strategies, must die in some sense for the true self to emerge. This dying is not dramatic. It does not usually happen all at once. It is more like a slow dissolution, a gradual letting go of identities and roles that no longer fit. And it is accompanied by grief. You grieve the person you thought you were supposed to be. You grieve the life you thought you were supposed to want. You grieve the relationships that cannot survive your transformation because they were built on the version of you that is now falling away. This grief is real and it is heavy, and it adds to the exhaustion because grief itself is exhausting. But within this exhaustion and grief, there is also something like relief. When you stop trying so hard to be someone you are not, when you allow yourself to acknowledge that the life you have been living does not fit, there is a strange kind of freedom in that acknowledgement. It is not the freedom of having answers. It is the freedom of finally telling the truth, even if only to yourself. You are tired. You are disconnected. You are going through the motions. And admitting this, allowing it to be true without immediately trying to fix it or shame yourself for it, is the first step towards something more authentic. People who live deeply often feel misunderstood, and this misunderstanding adds another layer to the exhaustion. When you withdraw because you need to conserve energy, others may interpret it as rejection. When you choose solitude over socializing, people may think you are depressed or antisocial. When you speak your truth, and it does not align with the prevailing narrative, you may be seen as difficult or negative. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being misread, from knowing that the way you are perceived is not at all who you actually are. You might try to explain yourself to help others understand that your need for solitude is not about them, that your depth is not darkness, that your questions are not complaints. But often these explanations fall flat because the people you are trying to explain yourself to are operating from a fundamentally different orientation. They do not live in their inner world the way you do. They do not need what you need. And so your attempts to be understood can feel like speaking into a void, which only deepens the sense of isolation. Jung would say that this misunderstanding is a form of projection. When people encounter someone who lives primarily in their inner world, someone who does not need constant external stimulation or validation, it can trigger discomfort. That discomfort gets projected back onto you as judgment. You are too serious. You are too quiet. You are cold or distant or aloof. But these judgments say more about the person making them than they do about you. Depth makes people uncomfortable when they're not accustomed to it. Authenticity can feel threatening when someone is invested in maintaining their own persona. And so rather than meeting you where you are, rather than accepting that you simply operate differently, they label you as the problem. They suggest, implicitly or explicitly, that you need to change, to lighten up, to be more like everyone else. And if you have internalized these messages, if you have spent years believing that there's something wrong with the way you are, then this external judgment reinforces your own inner critic and the exhaustion deepens. But what if there is nothing wrong with you? What if the way you are is simply the way you are, not better or worse than any other way, just different? What if your need for solitude is as valid as someone else's need for company? What if your preference for deep conversation over small talk is not snobbery, but simply an expression of where you find meaning? What if your exhaustion is not a personal failing, but a sign that you have been trying to live according to someone else's blueprint? These questions are not rhetorical. They are invitations to reconsider the story you have been telling yourself about who you are and what is wrong with you. Because often, the story we inherit from the culture around us is not true. It is just pervasive. It is just loud. And when you are tired, when your defenses are down and you do not have the energy to maintain the persona, you have an opportunity to hear a different story, one that comes from within. The inner voice, the one that speaks your truth, is quiet. It does not shout. It does not compete with the noise of the world. It simply waits patiently for you to become still enough to hear it. And exhaustion, paradoxically, can create that stillness. When you are too tired to keep running, too tired to keep performing, too tired to keep pretending, you finally stop. And in that stopping, in that collapse into stillness, the inner voice has a chance to be heard. It might not say much at first. It might just be a feeling, a sense that something is off, a quiet knowing that you cannot continue as you have been. But if you listen, if you give it space instead of immediately trying to fix the exhaustion or medicate it away or push through it with sheer willpower, it will begin to speak more clearly. This listening is not passive. It is an active form of attention, a willingness to sit with discomfort and uncertainty without rushing to resolve it. Jung called this active imagination, a practice of engaging with the images and feelings that arise from the unconscious without immediately translating them into rational categories. It requires that you trust the process, that you trust that your psyche knows what it is doing even when you do not understand it consciously. The exhaustion is not random. It is not arbitrary. It is a response to something, a message encoded in the body and the emotions. And if you can learn to read that message instead of treating it as an enemy to be defeated, you will find that it has something important to tell you. What it is often trying to tell you is that you are living out of alignment with your inner truth. You are giving your energy to things that do not matter to you, to roles that do not fit, to relationships that do not nourish you, to work that does not reflect your values. And the exhaustion is your inner self's way of withdrawing support from that misaligned life. It is not punishing you. It is protecting you. It is saying, in the only language it has, that if you continue on this path, you will lose yourself entirely. And so it pulls the plug on your energy, forcing you to stop, to reassess, to consider whether the life you are living is the life you actually want. This reassessment is not easy. It often involves facing uncomfortable truths. You might realize that you have been living for someone else's approval, that you have built a life around what you thought you should want rather than what you actually want. You might see how much of your identity is constructed around external achievements, around being seen as successful or good or responsible, and how little of it is rooted in your own inner sense of meaning. You might recognize that many of your relationships are transactional, based on mutual performance rather than genuine connection. These realizations are painful because they reveal the gap between the life you have been living and the life that would feel true. But they are also liberating because once you see the gap, you can begin close it. Closing that gap is the work of individuation. It is the process of gradually bringing your outer life into alignment with your inner truth. It does not happen all at once. It is not a matter of quitting your job, leaving your relationships, and starting over from scratch, though sometimes those dramatic changes are necessary. More often, it is a series of small adjustments, small choices to honor what is true for you even when it is inconvenient or uncomfortable. It is saying no to invitations that drain you, even when saying no feels selfish. It is choosing to spend time alone when you need it, even when others do not understand. It is speaking your truth in conversations, even when it disrupts the social harmony. It is pursuing work that feels meaningful to you, even when it does not fit the conventional definition of success. Each of these small choices is an act of alignment, a way of bringing your outer life closer to your inner reality. And as you make these choices, something shifts. The exhaustion begins to lift, not because your circumstances have necessarily changed dramatically, but because you are no longer fighting yourself. You are no longer spending energy maintaining a persona that does not fit. You are no longer betraying your own needs and values in order to meet external expectations. You're living more honestly, more authentically, and that honesty has its own kind of energy. It is not the manic energy of ambition or the driven energy of proving yourself. It is a quieter, steadier energy that comes from being aligned with who you actually are. This does not mean that life becomes easy. Authenticity has its own challenges. When you stop performing, some people will not like it. When you set boundaries, some relationships will end. When you pursue what matters to you rather than what is expected, you may face criticism or judgment. But these challenges are different from the exhaustion of living inauthentically. They are the challenges of being yourself in a world that often prefers conformity. And while they can be difficult, they do not drain you in the same way. There is a kind of integrity in facing these challenges, a sense that you are fighting for something that matters rather than just trying to survive. Jung believed that the second half of life is often when this process of individuation becomes most urgent. In the first half of life, we are focused on building, on establishing ourselves in the world, on meeting the developmental tasks of education, career, relationships, family. We are learning the rules, adapting to social expectations, constructing an identity that works in the external world. But somewhere around midlife, often triggered by a crisis or a profound exhaustion, the inner self begins to demand attention. The questions shift from what do I need to do to who am I really, and what does my life mean? This shift can be disorienting because it requires letting go of the certainties and identities that have defined you up to that point. But it is also an invitation to live more deeply, more truthfully, more fully. You do not have to be at midlife for this process to begin. For some people, especially those who are naturally introspective and sensitive, the call to inner truth comes early. They feel the misalignment sooner. They exhaust sooner. They cannot sustain the persona for as long as others might, because the gap between who they are and who they are pretending to be is too wide. And while this can feel like a curse, like being out of step with everyone else, it is also a gift. It means you have access to your inner truth earlier. It means you have the opportunity to build a life that is aligned with who you are before you have spent decades in misalignment. It means the exhaustion, as painful as it is actually guiding you towards something more real. The journey toward that something more real is not linear. There will be days when you feel clear, when you know what you need, and you have the courage to pursue it. And there will be days when you doubt everything, when the exhaustion returns, when you wonder if you're just being self-indulgent or lazy or broken. This is normal. Transformation is not a straight line. It is a spiral, returning again and again to the same issues, but from different levels of understanding. Each time you return, you see a little more clearly. You integrate a little more deeply. You become a little more yourself. Part of this process is learning to distinguish between the voice of your inner truth and the voice of your conditioning. The voice of conditioning is often louder. It is the internalized voice of parents, teachers, society, culture, telling you who you should be and what you should want. It speaks in shoulds and musts and have tos. It is anxious and demanding and often harsh. The voice of your inner truth is quieter. It speaks in whispers and feelings and subtle knowing. It does not argue or demand. It simply presents itself like a fact, like something you've always known but have been ignoring. Learning to hear this quieter voice requires practice and patience. It requires creating space for it through solitude, through reflection, through practices like journaling or walking or simply sitting in silence. It requires that you value your inner experience as much as you value external validation. This valuing of the inner experience is countercultural. We live in a world that is oriented almost entirely toward the external. Success is measured by visible achievements. Worth is determined by productivity. Connection is quantified by social media metrics. The inner world, the world of thoughts and feelings and dreams and reflections, is largely invisible and therefore largely undervalued. But for those who live primarily in that inner world, this external orientation is suffocating. It is like being asked to live in a language that is not your native tongue, to value things that do not actually matter to you, to ignore the richest and most meaningful parts of your experience because they cannot be measured or displayed. When you begin to honor your inner world, when you give it the time and attention it needs, something remarkable happens. You discover that you're not empty. You're not boring. You're not less than those who seem to thrive in the external world. You're simply different. Your richness is internal. Your complexity is psychological and spiritual rather than social. Your depth is in your capacity for reflection, for meaning-making, for holding paradox and ambiguity. And this depth, while it may not be visible or celebrated in conventional ways, is profoundly valuable. It is the source of art, of philosophy, of spiritual insight, of psychological wisdom. It is what allows you to see beneath the surface, to understand the hidden patterns, to connect with the universal human experiences that others might gloss over. But this depth also makes you vulnerable. When you feel things deeply, you can be hurt deeply. When you think about everything, you can become paralyzed by complexity. When you see the contradictions and hypocrisies in the world around you, you can become cynical or despairing. This is part of the cost of living consciously, of refusing to numb yourself or distract yourself from the truth of things. Jung spoke of this as the burden of consciousness, the weight of seeing clearly. And it is a real burden. There are days when you might wish you could be like others, when you could take things at face value, when you could be satisfied with superficial pleasures and easy answers. But you cannot. That is not who you are. And trying to be someone you're not is what leads to the exhaustion in the first place. So the work is not to become less deep, less sensitive, less complex. The work is to find a way to live that honors your depth without being overwhelmed by it. This might mean setting boundaries around how much you expose yourself to the chaos and pain of the world. It might mean choosing carefully who you allow into your inner life, reserving your deepest self for those who can actually meet you there. It might mean finding practices that help you process and integrate your experiences, whether that is therapy, creative expression, spiritual practice, or time in nature. It might mean accepting that you will never fit easily into conventional social structures and finding alternative ways to connect and contribute that feel more aligned with who you are. One of the most important shifts in this process is moving from seeing your sensitivity and depth as problems to be fixed to seeing them as essential aspects of who you are. This is not about idealizing or inflating yourself. It is about accepting reality. You are sensitive. You are deep. You think and feel intensely. This is not going to change. And trying to change it, trying to toughen up or lighten up or be more like everyone else, is a betrayal of your nature. It is what creates the exhaustion. But when you accept your nature, when you stop fighting it and start working with it, you can begin to build a life that actually fits you. You can find work that allows for depth and complexity. You can cultivate relationships with others who value the same things you do. You can create rhythms and routines that honor your need for solitude and reflection. You can stop apologizing for who you are and start living from that place. This acceptance is not resignation. It is not giving up or checking out. It is the opposite. It is engaging with life more fully because you are engaging as yourself rather than as a constructed persona. It is choosing to live authentically even when that is difficult, even when it means being misunderstood, even when it means walking a path that looks different from everyone else's. And there's a kind of courage in this choice, a quiet bravery that is not about grand gestures or dramatic stands, but about the daily decision to be true to yourself. The exhaustion you feel is not the end of the story. It is a chapter, an important one, but not the final one. It is the chapter where the old way of being breaks down, where the persona cracks, where the misalignment becomes too painful to ignore. And while this chapter is difficult, it is also necessary. It is the fertile void from which something new can emerge. Jung called this the process of death and rebirth. And while the language is dramatic, the experience is often quite ordinary. It is the slow realization that you cannot continue as you have been. It is the gradual letting go of identities and expectations that no longer serve you. It is the tentative exploration of what might be true for you, even when you do not have all the answers. And the answers do not come all at once. They come slowly, through trial and error, through paying attention to what gives you energy and what drains you, through noticing what feels true and what feels false. This is the practice of individuation, the lifelong work of becoming yourself. It is not a destination you arrive at. It is a process, a path, a way of being in the world that is oriented toward inner truth rather than external validation. And while it is not easy, while it requires courage and honesty and a willingness to be different, it is also deeply satisfying. There is a kind of peace that comes from living authentically, from knowing that your life, however unconventional it might be, is truly yours. You might find that as you move toward this authenticity, your life becomes quieter. You might have fewer friends, but the friendships you have are deeper. You might be less visible in the world, but more present to yourself. You might achieve less in conventional terms, but feel more fulfilled. This is the trade-off, and it is a trade-off worth making if what you value is truth and depth and meaning. Because the alternative, the life of constant performance and exhaustion and disconnection from yourself, is not sustainable. It might work for a while, but eventually it breaks down. Eventually, the inner truth demands to be heard. So if you are exhausted, if you feel like you cannot continue, if you are questioning everything about your life, know that you are not broken. You are not failing. You are being called. You are being called to something deeper, something truer, something more aligned with who you actually are. This call is not comfortable. It disrupts everything. It asks you to let go of certainties and securities. It asks you to trust yourself when you have been taught to trust external authorities. It asks you to value your inner experience when the world tells you it does not matter. But it is a call worth answering because on the other side of this exhaustion, on the other side of this breakdown, is the possibility of a life that actually feels like yours. And you do not have to have it all figured out. You do not have to know exactly what that life looks like or how to get there. You just have to start listening. You have to create space for the inner voice to speak. You have to honor what it tells you, even when it is inconvenient, even when it goes against what everyone expects. You have to trust that your exhaustion is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of wisdom, your inner self's way of protecting you from a life that is not truly yours. Jung believed that the unconscious is not just a repository of repressed material, but a source of wisdom and guidance. It knows things that the conscious mind does not. It sees patterns and possibilities that are hidden from ordinary awareness. And it communicates through symptoms, through dreams, through emotions, through the body. The exhaustion is one of those communications. It is the unconscious saying that something needs to change, that you're living out of balance, that your conscious choices are not aligned with your deeper nature. And if you can learn to read this communication, if you can treat it as information rather than as a problem, you will find that it is actually trying to help you. This is the paradox of exhaustion. It feels like a collapse, like an ending, like everything falling apart. But it is also a beginning. It is the beginning of a more authentic life. It is the beginning of a deeper relationship with yourself. It is the beginning of a journey toward wholeness, toward integration, toward becoming who you were always meant to be. And while the journey is long and often difficult, it is also the most meaningful work you can do. Because in the end, the only life worth living is the one that is truly yours, the one that reflects your deepest values and your truest self, the one that honors the complexity and depth and sensitivity that make you who you are. So rest. Allow yourself to be tired. Do not fight the exhaustion or shame yourself for it. Let it be what it is, a message, a call, an invitation to something deeper. And when you are ready, when you have rested enough, begin to listen. Begin to ask what this exhaustion is trying to tell you. Begin to explore what a more authentic life might look like for you. Begin to make the small choices that bring your outer life into alignment with your inner truth. And trust that even though the path is unclear, even though you cannot see the destination, you are moving in the right direction. You are moving toward yourself. And that is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything.